If you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to the channel. And if you're enjoying these stories, there's a link below to buy me a cup of coffee. This is the Chassidic Story Project with Barak Hullman, podcasting from Jerusalem, Israel. This podcast is sponsored by listeners just like you. To become a supporter of this podcast, please go to HasidicStory.com. HASIDIC story.com. You'll never know. You'll never know. You'll never know. You'll never know. Shalom Aleichem, my sweetest friends. It is my absolute pleasure to be recording the stories again this week. And as everybody knows, we're already in the month of Adar, getting ready for Purim, Be'ezrat Hashem, the great day of Purim. And so this week I have 3 stories for you. But before I begin, I want to dedicate this podcast episode to the continued success of our soldiers in battle wherever they are, Be'ezrat Hashem, the returning of all the hostages whole, healthy, and alive, the refuah shlema, the full recovery of everybody who's been injured or who is ill, the comforting of those that lost loved ones, and the continued unity of the Jewish people here in the land of Israel and all around the world, God willing. This is a story that took place around 100 years ago in Tsarist Russia. Now, of course, that was a difficult time for the Jewish people. Also, after Tsarist Russia, it was a difficult time for the Jewish people in the Soviet Union. The Jews lived under harsh restrictions with limited rights, and they were constantly being persecuted. And the government did not trust the Jewish courts or religious authorities, so most legal matters had to be handled by the civil Russian courts that were many times biased against the Jews. And so, because of this, there were 2 wealthy businessmen who had decided to become partners in a large investment. Maybe it was lumber or a textile factory or grain, whatever it was. And these were serious business people, and they were dealing with significant sums of money at the time. And this was at a time when most Jews were having a difficult time even putting bread on their table. But these 2 businessmen were very fortunate. And so they wanted to finalize their agreement for their business investment. But of course they weren't going to go to the civil court. So they went to the great Rabbi Yitzchak Yoel Rafalovitz, to finalize the agreement. Now Rabbi Rafalovitz was known for his wisdom and integrity. And in those days, a respected rabbi was not just a spiritual leader, but also a judge and a counselor for the community. And the Jewish people trusted their rabbis much more than they would ever trust any of the Tsar's corrupt officials. So they went in front of Rabbi Rafalovitz. They told him about their business deal. They signed the papers in front of the rabbi. But because so much money was involved in this business deal, in order to create the trust that each side would fulfill their obligation, each of the businessmen agreed to deposit a huge sum of 1,000 rubles with the rabbi on the condition that if either of them broke their side of the agreement, the other would receive all the money to cover his losses. Now, 1,000 rubles in those days was an enormous sum of money. Just to put things in perspective, a simple worker might earn 20 rubles a month. So this amount of money represented many years of earnings for an ordinary person. And this also shows the seriousness of their agreement and the level of trust that they put in the rabbi. Now, my friends, you have to understand something so deep here. It was forbidden for any rabbi that wasn't authorized by the government to do such a thing in Tsarist Russia. All large monetary cases had to be brought only to official government courts. But Rabbi Rafalovitz really had no choice because the Jewish businessmen didn't trust the civil courts. And if he wasn't there to act as a judge, who knows what would be? There'd be total chaos. And so that put the rabbi in a very difficult position between his duty to his community and the laws of the land. But understanding that if the rabbi didn't play the role of the judge, then there might not be peace in the Jewish community, he felt it was a mitzvah for himself to take the risk to allow the businessmen to make their agreement. And so the rabbi took the money and took the agreement, and many years passed. And after a few years, the partnership between the 2 businessmen turned the opposite way. It was clear that one of the businessmen misused the funds and broke the agreement. And an investigation was made, and everything was officially documented that one of the partners had truly misused the funds and broke the agreement. So the other partner went to the rabbi with the proof, and after the rabbi went over it and inspected everything, he agreed and gave all of the deposit money to the partner who had been cheated, but unfortunately that didn't even cover most of his losses. But when the crooked partner heard about this, he was so angry that he reported the rabbi to the police and handed in the agreement that the rabbi had signed as proof of his claim. Now, this wasn't just a simple complaint to the police. This was a serious crime in the eyes of the Tsarist authorities, who were always looking for reasons to crack down on unofficial Jewish institutions like the rabbi and a Beit Din. The rabbi knew that he had done something illegal. He was doing it only for the best reasons, but it was illegal. And he knew that if he was punished, he might be sent to Siberia or even face the death penalty, God forbid. And the next day there was a knock on the rabbi's door, and 2 policemen were there, presenting him with a subpoena to stand trial in a week. And if he didn't show up, his whole family would be arrested and sent to Siberia. And he, the same or worse, God forbid, he was in a terrible bind and he didn't know what to do. And these weren't just any policemen, but these were representatives of the court, which had a special distaste for the Jews. A subpoena in those days meant for sure that a Jew was going to be found guilty, no matter how much evidence there was that he might not be. And as if that wasn't enough, a few days later, his pregnant wife complained that she didn't feel the child in her womb, God forbid. She ran to the doctor, who announced that the fetus was dead and he had to operate and remove it, but she didn't want to listen to him. She also didn't want to believe him. But on the other hand, what if he was right? And she was confused and scared and didn't know what to do. And of course, medical care in those days was very primitive compared to the standards that we have today. Operations were dangerous, and there was the high risk of infection, and there were no antibiotics. And what the doctor said meant not only that the child might have been lost, but the mother's life might be as well, God forbid. And it was all happening at the same time. For Rabbi Rafalovitz, this was a nightmare, a living nightmare. And then it became all clear to him. He had to go to the Rebbe, his Rebbe, who at the time was the Rebbe Maharash, Rabbi Shmuel of Lubavitcher, who lived from 1834 to 1882 and was the 4th Lubavitcher Rebbe. Now everybody knows that the Rebbe Maharash is famous for his saying that the world says, if you can't go under an obstacle, go over it. But I say, L'chatchila ariber, start off going over it. And that became one of the slogans of Chabad. Now, of course, the listeners to this podcast know what a Rebbe meant to a Chassid in those days, and today as well, of course. The Rebbe wasn't just a teacher or a leader, but was a spiritual guide that could see things that the Chassidim could not, and see openings where others only saw walls. And the next day, when Rabbi Rafalovitz arrived in Lubavitch, he wasn't doing so well. In just a week, he'd be standing trial, and his wife and the baby, and every second was precious. You know, traveling to Lubavitch in those days was no simple matter. It took several days by horse and carriage over rough, muddy roads, and he was thinking the whole time about his wife and their baby and the trial. And normally, it would take weeks in order to get into the Rebbe. But as soon as he arrived in Lubavitch, he was allowed to go in and see the Rebbe. And so before he knew it, he was standing in the Rebbe's office, pouring out his heart, crying, the trial, his wife. Every second, Rebbe, what do I do? And the Rebbe smiled and he said, Rabbi Yitzchak Yol, why are you in such a hurry? Why are you so stressed? In any case, it's already Wednesday evening. You're going to be here for Shabbos. After Shabbos, we'll discuss your problems. And Rabbi Rafalovitz was a little surprised because, well, the Rebbe's answer did calm him down. He was right, the trial would only be in a week, and maybe his wife's situation wasn't so bad, but then again, he couldn't concentrate over the next 2 days. He tried to sit in the Beit Midrash and learn, but he couldn't get his worries off of his mind. And when Shabbos came around, despite the calm and the holiness of the day, he was so troubled that when the Rebbe gave over a long and complicated mimer, which is a Chassidic discourse filled with deep Kabbalistic ideas, Rabbi Rafalovitz's mind couldn't hear a single word. Now, normally, Shabbos in Lubavitch would be a high spiritual experience for any chassid because of the special atmosphere of being around the Rebbe, the davening, being around fellow chassidim, and especially the Rebbe's teachings like a mimer. But the rabbi could not stop thinking about his problems. And he would comfort himself and he would say, after Shabbos, things are going to be different. After Shabbos, I'm going to see the Rebbe, and the Rebbe will help me. And sure enough, as soon as Shabbos was over, he was allowed into the Rebbe's room, and he stood there waiting for the Rebbe to save him. And the Rebbe says to him, Rabbi Yitzchak Yol, what did you think of the mimer I said on Shabbos? And the Rebbe said, mimer? Rebbe, I'm sorry, but I had so many thoughts in my mind, I couldn't even hear a word that you were saying. The Rebbe said, okay, go find somebody who wrote it down, and when you know it by heart, come back to me and let's talk again. And here was Rabbi Rafalovitz thinking that he couldn't concentrate on learning, that he's just going to go into the Rebbe's room and the Rebbe's going to bless him or give us some advice or both. But the Rebbe says, no, even in the time of your stress, even when you can't concentrate, find the menuchat nefesh, the peace of mind, to sit and learn the mimer. And so having no choice, Rabbi Rafalovitz left the room, and he found a young man who had a photographic memory and had written down the mimer that he heard on Shabbos. Rabbi Rafalovitz made a copy for himself and spent the entire night learning until the next morning when he entered the Rebbe's room for the third time, having memorized every single word of the mimer. Now, of course, you know, my friends, that this was the Chassidic tradition, that when a discourse would be given on Shabbos or Yom Tov, there would be several Chassidim with photographic memories who would memorize the Rebbe's words. Then they would all get together and make a unified version of what the Rebbe had said, and then the Rebbe would edit it. And that's how we have the Rebbe's teachings that were given on Shabbos and Yom Tov. So the Rebbe listened to Rabbi Rafalovitz give over the repetition. He nodded and gave him a blessing for success in the trial, and also a mazel tov on the child that his wife would give birth to in a few months. Now for Rabbi Rafalovitz, the blessing of the Rebbe were not just words. It was a conduit for divine energy. It was opening the gates of heaven, and Rabbi Rafalovitz received not just one blessing, but 2 life-changing blessings. And all he had to do was memorize the mimer. He thanked the Rebbe, and he ran to a telegraph office where he sent his wife an urgent message saying, don't do any operations and don't worry. And early the next morning, he went off to Petersburg, where the trial was going to take place, facing the reality of having to go to court as a Jew and trusting in Hashem that the Rebbe's bracha was going to be with him. Now, normally, the rabbi would have been stressed, but he knew that the Rebbe's bracha was so strong, it was even stronger than the darkness of the courts in Petersburg. Now, the rabbi needed to stay someplace, and he happened to have a good friend who lived in the capital city. And he told him about visiting the Rebbe and memorizing the mimer and the blessing for his wife and the trial. And he said to his friend, you know, somehow everything's going to work out. And the friend said, you know what, I have an idea. Every morning, there's an old peasant woman that comes to deliver milk to all the houses in this area. And one of those houses is the house of the judge who's going to be presiding over your case. And everyone loves the milk lady. She's friends with everyone. And she told me that the judge's wife often consults with her. So this is the plan. Tomorrow morning when she brings the milk, we're going to start crying. And when she hears your story, Be'ezrat Hashem, she'll help. Now, who would have imagined that a peasant milk lady would be the solution to this life-threatening problem? But when the old lady showed up the next morning and heard them crying, and she said, oh, what's going on? What's going on? Because, of course, she wanted to know every piece of gossip she could get her hands on. When she heard the rabbi's story, she told them, don't worry, I'll take care of it. And when she brought milk to the judge's house and was greeted by the wife of the judge, the milk lady started crying. And she had tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks as she was explaining to the judge's wife that a relative of hers, an honest, upstanding, caring, and righteous man with a family and a pregnant wife, was falsely accused of a mistake that he made. And with no money or powerful friends, the milk lady is worried that he will be sent to prison after the trial here tomorrow. So the judge's wife calls her husband over, and she tells the milk lady to repeat the story. And again, the milk lady cried and talked about her relative and how he's so honest and upstanding and caring and righteous, and a man with a family and a pregnant wife and falsely accused. And the judge listened, and he promised that he would do all that he could. Now, this was very unusual at a time when Russian officials could care less about Jews. And even the milk lady herself was a little surprised how emotional she was about this rabbi, and also that the judge's wife cared, and that the judge is caring as well. But of course, Rabbi Rafalovitz, he knew that all of this was a result of the tzaddik's blessing, the blessing of the Rebbe. And the next day, when the judge took his seat and looked through the charges and the evidence, he looked over at the rabbi and he realized he had no chance whatsoever. And normally, he wouldn't care. Let the Jew go to Siberia. Why should I care? But something stirred inside of him, and he couldn't understand it because he had no love for Jews. But he thought about the tears of the milk lady and his wife, and the rabbi as a family and a pregnant wife. And then the judge had an idea. He called the court to order.
Order in the court!
And called one case after another, putting the rabbi's case until the end. And when there was only the rabbi's case left, he announced a recess, and everyone stood as he walked down the aisle to leave the courtroom. But on his way out, he happened to pass by the prosecuting lawyer, and he whispered under his breath, "You clowns don't have a clue what you got yourselves into." And then the judge left the courtroom. The prosecution was shocked. What did the judge mean? Maybe they'd made a mistake? And knowing that the judge always took long breaks, they left the courtroom to reconsider, to figure out where they'd gone wrong. But this time the judge returned within a few minutes. He took his place behind the bench and then said, "The state versus Rafalovich. Where's the prosecution? Will the prosecution step forward?" And nobody answered because, of course, they were going over the evidence, trying to figure out where they had gone wrong. And again, the judge said, "Where is the prosecution?" And no one answered. So the judge raised his gavel up high, banged it on the block on the table, and he says, "The prosecution has forfeited. The case is dismissed, and court is dismissed." And then he stood up and handed the rabbi the whole portfolio with all of the evidence against him, informed him that he was innocent of all charges, and told him to destroy the papers as soon as possible. And then the judge said he would make sure that Rabbi Rafalovitz would now have official government permission to judge in all monetary cases in the future. And Rabbi Rafalovitz, even though he trusted in the Rebbe and knew that miracles were happening, he was still stunned. He was free. And a half a year later, the Rebbe's second bracha came true. To the amazement of all the doctors, his wife gave birth to a healthy baby boy. And now this is one of the deepest Torahs, my friends. The Rebbe made Rabbi Rafalovitz study Torah precisely when it seemed like he had no time for it, showing us that even in our most difficult moments, connecting to Torah opens up the gates of salvation. And when we trust in the tzaddik and follow his guidance, even though sometimes it seems like it doesn't make any sense, it can open a conduit for miracles to happen, where we all merit, Be'ezrat Hashem, to have such faith in difficult times, to trust our teachers and our rabbis and the tzaddikim, to trust in Hashem, knowing that even peasant milk ladies can sometimes pull us out of impossible situations. I have another story for you. This is a story about the Chazon Ish, Rabbi Avraham Yeshaya Karelitz, who lived from 1878 to 1953. And he was one of the great Torah geniuses and giants of the previous generation. Now, when we speak about the Chazon Ish, he was such a great tzaddik whose Torah knowledge was so vast and so profound that even the secular, and I would say anti-religious leaders of the state of Israel stood in awe of the Chazon Ish. And during those early years of the state of Israel, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, the country, much like today, was still trying to find its way. But I would say more so back then than today. The tension between the religious and secular communities was very strong. I know from my chavuta, who was in his 80s and grew up in Jerusalem, and told me about the fights that the Haredim and the secular Jews in Jerusalem, the kids at least, used to get into. And there were many debates back then about what the Jewish state should look like. And I should say also today, but back then, of course, was really the beginning. And it was in this complex time in the state of Israel that Rabbi Shlomo Lawrence served for over 30 years in the Knesset. Now, Rabbi Lawrence, who lived from 1918 to 2009, was born in Hungary, survived the Holocaust, became one of the most influential religious politicians in Israel's history. As a member of the Agudat Yisrael party, he was in a unique position to be trusted by the great Torah sages here in the land of Israel, and also the secular government of Israel. And through his diplomatic skills and personal integrity, he was respected in both worlds. Now, Rabbi Lawrence wasn't just a member of Knesset. He served in the Defense and Foreign Affairs Committee and other important committees, working tirelessly to help Torah institutions and the religious community here in Israel. And what made his work so powerful is the respect that he earned from his fellow MKs, both religious and non-religious alike. They respected him for his honesty, his integrity, his conviction, and his wisdom. And at the same time, the Gedolim, the great Torah leaders of the generation, respected him as well for the same reasons. And this wasn't an easy task because, as I said, my friends, in those days religious Jews were often looked down upon in Israeli politics. Even Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, who founded, of course, the State of Israel and was known for his secular outlook, used to enjoy talking with Rabbi Lawrence. Once, Ben-Gurion asked Rabbi Lawrence to show him in the Torah where there's any hint to an exemption from army service for yeshiva students, because it was a big issue back then, and all the more so today. Although I have to say, many of the elder Haredi men that I know and I daven with and I'm friends with, all of them served in the army, without exception. I'm sure there were exceptions, but not the ones that I know. So, once Ben-Gurion asked Rabbi Lawrence, where does it say in the Torah that there's an exemption for yeshiva students? And Rabbi Lawrence showed him the Rambam's description of the tribe of Levi in Mishnah Torah, where the Rambam explains that the Levites didn't go to war or own land because they were set aside to serve Hashem, and that this status extends to anyone dedicated to divine service. And it could be that was one of the arguments that exempted yeshiva students at the time. In the early 50s, there was an incident that took place in which two Israeli brothers ended up in prison. This was in a time when Israel was still developing its legal system, which, once again, I should say it still is, and still trying to find the balance between Jewish law and secular Western law. There were two brothers who lived in a farming community and had shared a large ranch house. And they had a barn and a chicken coop, and they lived a simple life. They weren't religious, completely secular, but they were far away from everyone. And this was at a time when many Jews were building new lives with agricultural settlements across Israel, and some of them came from religious backgrounds, and coming to Israel gave them the opportunity to distance themselves from tradition, embracing the pioneering spirit of building the new country. And one night, a man broke into their chicken coop, planning on stealing the chickens, and the brothers heard the break-in. They struggled with the man, and in the end, one of the brothers hit the thief on the head and killed him. And when the authorities arrived, they didn't believe the brother's account. They thought that they had just murdered this man, and they threw the two brothers in jail. And after a long and very public trial, they were found guilty and sentenced to multiple years in prison for murder. Now, this was at a time when the Israeli justice system was establishing its reputation, and the case received extensive media coverage. It touched on self-defense, property rights, the appropriate use of force, all very important issues. And one day, Rabbi Lawrence received a message in his office from none other than the Chazon Ish. This wasn't long before the tzaddik passed away, and he asked Rabbi Lawrence to please ask the president of the State of Israel at the time, Yitzchak Ben Tzvi, to waive the remaining years on the sentence of these two brothers and allow them to go free. President Yitzchak Ben Tzvi, who lived from 1884 to 1963, was Israel's second president, and he was a scholar and a historian with a deep interest in Jewish communities from around the world. Although he himself was not religiously observant, he had a great deal of respect for Jewish tradition and learning. And Rabbi Lawrence was surprised. Like most people, they'd already forgotten about the trial that had taken place 8 months before. Out of sight, out of mind. But now Rabbi Lawrence went to the home of the Chazon Ish, and he found him so weak he was laying in bed. And he asked the tzaddik why he felt Rabbi Lawrence should go to the president and ask that he pardon the two convicted murderers. And the Chazon Ish said, according to rabbinic law, these two brothers should not have been found guilty in the first place, and for sure not have been sentenced to such a long imprisonment. We know that this case appears in the Gemara, and everybody knows this phrase, Haba lehogecha, one that comes to kill you, hashkem lehogo, wake up early in the morning and kill him first. They found someone breaking into their property, and they didn't know what his intentions were, so in order to protect themselves and their possessions, they fought back and he was killed. For this, they should not serve a long sentence. The Chazon Ish added that he should tell the president in his name that 8 months in prison was long enough and that they shouldn't have to serve any longer than that. Rabbi Lawrence wasn't sure that the president would listen to him, but because it was the Chazon Ish asking, he promised he would do everything he could. You see, the Chazon Ish, despite his poor health at the time, and the fact that these were not religious Jews, they weren't part of the Haredi community, he was concerned with justice according to Torah principles. It wasn't about politics or public opinion. It was about what was right in the eyes of halacha. And Rabbi Lawrence made an appointment and brought the case before President Ben-Zvi. He explained that the Chazon Ish feels that 8 months is enough and they should be set free. And the president's face showed that he was surprised. He said, "I've heard about the greatness of the Chazon Ish, but I never realized to what extent. For him to be so concerned about 2 brothers who he doesn't even know personally and even calculate how much of a jail sentence they should serve, this is beyond my comprehension." And so the president said he would see what he could do. And this also shows the incredible respect that the Chazon Ish had with the secular leaders. Recognizing his wisdom and compassion went beyond religious matters. He cared about all Jews. And indeed, not long after that, the brothers were released from jail. They returned back to their farm, but they were changed men. After learning that it was the Chazon Ish that asked the president to pardon them, they became serious God-fearing Jews and even Torah scholars and spent much of their days learning Torah. These 2 brothers who had lived secular lives were so moved by the concern of this great tzaddik who didn't even know them that it transformed their entire lives. The Chazon Ish didn't just save them from prison, he opened the door for them to discover a life of Torah learning and a life of emunah. And this is what it means when our sages teach us that whoever saves a single life, it's as if they saved an entire world. The Chazon Ish wasn't just concerned about their physical freedom, but also their spiritual freedom as well. And Rabbi Lawrence, through his respected position and his willingness to be the messenger of the tzaddik, became part of this chain of divine providence. May we all merit to see how the smallest act of kindness and justice can transform our lives in ways that we could never imagine. And may we learn from the Chazon Ish to look beyond the surface and to care about every Jew, regardless of their background or their level of observance. Sometimes the greatest spiritual transformations begin with an act of justice and compassion. I have one more story for you, and of course there has to be a Purim story, and I promise you more Purim stories are coming. This happened on Purim in 1953, and this was at a time after the Tsars had been overthrown by the Bolsheviks, who eventually became the Soviets, and there were many millions of Jews that were trapped behind the Iron Curtain. This was during the Cold War, after World War II, when millions of Jews in the Soviet Union were living under the brutal dictatorship of Joseph Stalin. Stalin, Yamach Shemo, may his name be erased, was one of the most murderous dictators in human history. It's said that he murdered something like 20 million people. Millions of people were executed and sent to labor camps, and he had a particular hatred for the Jews and launched an anti-Jewish campaign known as the Doctors' Plot. Stalin had accused Jewish doctors of conspiring to poison Soviet leaders. Of course, this was just a fabricated excuse to launch the massive murder of Soviet Jews. Secret police were arresting Jewish doctors throughout the whole Soviet Union, and Jewish cultural institutions were being shut down. Newspapers were filled with anti-Jewish propaganda, and many historians believe that Stalin was planning to deport most of Soviet Jewry to Siberia and let them die there in the terrible conditions. And many of these Jews were Jews that had just survived the Holocaust a few years earlier. On Purim in 1953, the holiday that commemorates the miraculous salvation of the Jewish people from Haman's genocidal plot back in ancient Persia, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, Zatzal, was speaking to hundreds of the Chassidim in the hall in 770 Eastern Parkway in Brooklyn. And the Rebbe's Farbrengens, of course, were known for their deep spiritual content. The Rebbe shared deep Torah insights and Chassidus. They would last for many hours, where the Chassidim would hang on every word, absorbing all of the wisdom and spiritual energy that the Rebbe gave over. And on this particular Purim, something extraordinary happened. The Rebbe, for no apparent reason, suddenly changed the subject from his deep Torah discourse and announced, "Let's all cheer, hurrah, hurrah!" And then the Rebbe began shouting over and over again, "Hurrah, hurrah!" The Chassidim, who were used to the Rebbe being serious when he was giving over a talk, they were surprised by this sudden shift. But if the Rebbe said to say hurrah, they were going to say hurrah. And the whole room was rocking from everyone shouting, hurrah, hurrah, hurrah. Hundreds, maybe thousands of Chassidim, probably a little drunk from Purim, spontaneously broke out in cheers of hurrah. And then suddenly the Rebbe became silent again and returned to his speaking in the deep, serious way that he had been before, as if nothing happened. And the Chassidim didn't understand what was the strange behavior of the Rebbe. But the next day, the mystery was explained. The next day's newspapers read, Stalin is dead. The dictator and tyrant had suffered a massive heart attack on March 1st, 1953, which was exactly the day of Purim in New York that year. And he died several days later on March 5th. And then the details were revealed that Stalin was planning on purging all of the Jews of the Soviet Union. But because he had suffered that heart attack on Purim, he couldn't carry it out. And do you know what the Rebbe was saying when he was shouting hurrah? In Hebrew, hurrah means he is evil. And this was no coincidence. The Rebbe was taking the spiritual energy of Purim and making sure that Stalin did not survive that year. And what makes this story even more powerful is a similar story told about the Tzemach Tzedek, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the same name as the last Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was the third Lubavitcher Rebbe and the great-great-grandfather of the later Rebbe, who passed away in 1866. The Tzemach Tzedek, who was also leading the Jewish community in a difficult time for Russian Jews, when he was reading the Megillah one year, apparently, whatever kavanot he had led to Tsar Nicholas I dying on that same day, 150 years earlier. If I was a Russian or Soviet leader, I would be very concerned about Purim. Tsar Nicholas I, of course, had enacted the Cantonist decrees, which drafted young boys as young as 12 for 25 years into the Russian army. And these Jewish children were subjected to brutal conditions and relentless pressure to convert to Christianity. And so, my friends, Purim, I could say so much about Purim, but no, it's not just today. Today, when the gates of heaven are so wide open, you and I can daven for one another and bring miracles. And if you doubt it, just look at what these two Rebbes did, taking out the greatest evil in the world at the time. May we merit to see such wonders in our own time. May all of the enemies of the Jewish people dissolve, just like Stalin and the Tsar. We should know that today the same divine providence that operated in ancient Shushan, in Tsarist Russia, and the Soviet Union continues to watch over us and protect the Jewish people in every generation.
La
Thank you so much for listening, my sweetest friends, as always. I hope your preparations for Purim are going well. Thank you from the bottom of my heart to all the contributors to this podcast. Thank you very much. And also to all the listeners and all the people that send me comments and meet me on the street and send me emails. Thank you to all of you. And I hope you have a beautiful Shabbos and a beautiful week. And until next week, my sweetest friends, take care of yourselves and sei gesund.
Order in the court!